Hey folks, Ben Maloney here again. Well, since I started doing these videos, you'd think it'd be kind of easy for me to come up with video topics, and for the most part it is. And I can hear myself echoing, so let me just turn down my speaker real quick. Okay, that's better. Nothing can go wrong when it's live, am I right? Well, anyway, yeah, I'm usually the kind of person who can come up with some topics to talk about easily, especially because only doing these videos once a week, that'll definitely help with me trying to find stuff worth talking about, because now I could end up talking about something that really isn't that relevant and probably won't be relevant like a week or a month or a year from now. So yeah, I'm just gonna take my time and just make the videos as I come up with them. And with so many other topics I wanted to talk about, I think I finally narrowed it down because I really want to talk about Stan Lee. Now, let me make it clear here. I am not the biggest comics fan you would ever meet. Big shock, I know. My exposure to comics was mostly went to the lengths of newspaper comics. That's generally the kind of comics I like. Mostly because you really don't have to keep up with storylines or anything like that for the most part. You could pick up a comic and it's still, you can pick up a Sunday Funny and it's funny for the most part, just reading it that day. And as with comic books and superhero fiction, I don't know, I just could never get into them. Like, I don't like the fact that you gotta collect multiple comics just in the storylines and everything, and it's really hard to, yeah, it's just really hard to keep up with, and for the most part, it's like, I mean, I've heard some people say, oh, you can follow characters if you want, but you're better off following comic book writers than you are following characters, which is kind of frustrating because if there's certain characters I like, I really want to follow them, but if they get handed off to bad writers who don't know how to write them, then that's not good. So yeah, and besides, with all like spaces comic books take up and all the collecting I do to get all the storylines and everything, that's just space I'd rather reserve for my porno magazine collection. I think I said a little too much there. So, for the most part, I've always been interested in superheroes, but I've never really been that big into comics themselves. But, as with Steven Hillenburg's death, we saw the death of another legend, and that legend was Stan Lee. And I find Stan Lee to be a very fascinating individual because you really don't have to be a comic book fan to know exactly who he is, because he's just one of those guys that was all over the place. Like, I think my first big exposure to him was when I played the Spider-Man PS2 game from like the year 2000, you know which one, or the PS1 game and Nintendo 64 game, you know the one I'm talking about. And Stan Lee was in the intro. It's like, welcome, true believers. It's like, Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee here. And I was like, whoa. It's like, I wasn't expecting that. And little did I know that would be my first exposure to Stan Lee. And my fascination with this man just grew and grew the more I got to know about him. So, comic book enthusiasts probably already know his story and everything like that, but for those of you who don't know, basically he grew up in the early 1900s to Romanian Jewish parents. Started out from humble beginnings and eventually became probably the most famous comic book writer of all time. And yeah, that's pretty much a summary of his story. But reading about him and doing research and finding out just who he is, it's like he really was one of the true creative geniuses and nicest people that really you don't get a lot in this world, and it's just heartwarming to know that he existed. And which is why someone like me is making this video, because just finding out about him and just how great of a man he was, I couldn't help it. It's like, I feel like Stan Lee has really been a part of my life, whether I wanted to admit it or not. But even though I'm not that big of a comic book fan, because I do love me some Marvel movies, and as everybody knows, he's made a cameo in practically all of them. And that's what always fascinated me. It's like that's just the kind of presence he always had. It's like he was always there and always wanting to have fun. And I've read stories about him attending comic book conventions and just being the life of the party. And he was just overall a really nice and fun guy to be around. And the fact that he was still doing this, even though he was 90 years, he died at the age of 95, and he was still doing this up until his death, that just goes to show. It's like, it's fascinating to me as somebody who, okay, I'm gonna be real here, I'm probably gonna go into more detail about this in a future video, but I have a extreme fear of getting old, mostly because all the grandparents I've seen die, watching both my grandmothers die and seeing how they were on their last legs, and the fact that I remember them being so chip and full of life, and just seeing them no longer be alive, I just don't like to think about it. But that's what I fear. It's like I don't want to be that when I grow older, because the general consensus is that our society is way obsessed with youth, and that the older you get, the less valuable you are. And I guess that's somewhat played a part in my fear. But anyway, Stan Lee took that rule and just slapped it right across the face, and he was basically a true testament that growing old is mandatory, but growing up is optional. And oh man, I just can't stop talking. And it's just that kind of mentality and that view of life that he had. It's very inspiring in a way, and I encourage more young people to follow that philosophy, because it's true. Just because you're growing older doesn't exactly mean that you're getting older. You can, it's like, stay as young as you want for as long as you want. It's like, what's stopping you? Sure, you'll probably gain more weight than you did as a kid. You probably won't be as fast or hyperactive, but at the same time, you can still pump yourself full of life and just continue to live as long as you want. And as somebody who wants to have a lasting legacy and enjoy as much as this world has to offer before I finally kick the bucket, I think it's Stan Lee and his philosophy on life and what he did that has truly inspired me to follow in his footsteps. Not only that, but one big thing about Stan Lee that I highly think is worth talking about is the fact that he was one of the first comic book creators to, if not the first, to basically make superheroes more like characters, because for the longest time superheroes were basically they were basically the new age Greek heroes or mythological heroes. They were perfect in every way, they were escapist fantasy, and basically they had little to no flaws in them. But Stan Lee came around and he wanted to make his heroes more relatable and human-like, and he wanted his heroes to have more real-life problems that people could connect with. And it's safe to say that nowadays, it's like every other comic creator has fallen his influence, because how many superhero movies do you see nowadays where it's like the characters are either mythological beings who are trying to become human, or they're humans who are trying to become heroes. I think I heard the famous quote is that if DC heroes were gods becoming human, then Marvel heroes are humans becoming gods. And I think that perfectly summarizes Stan Lee and his work and his approach to making these characters. He really wanted wanted to inspire people to be the best they can, because you just never know the great things you're capable of until you try to make a difference in the world. It's like, I'm serious, folks. I'm getting kind of teary-eyed just saying this kind of stuff. And I know that's really sappy by my standards, but I just now got into this stuff after he died, and I had no idea that he had such great views on life that so much mimic my own. It's really fascinating. And I think probably the biggest one for me, at least, it's like being a minority myself, is the fact that he was one of the first comic book creators, and again, if not the first, to include minority superheroes in his stories. Because let's play flashback here. It was the 1960s. Like, civil rights movement was on the rise. America was trying to the Vietnam War was going on. Americans were trying to get along more than ever. So Stan Lee comes around with Jack Kirby and he creates Black Panther, which, from what I could tell, was mainstream comics' first black superhero. That is pretty cool. And he didn't stop there. He didn't do it for the fact that, he didn't do it to be different. He did it because he generally was interested in telling those kinds of stories, because he wasn't one of the guys who wanted to make those he didn't want to write characters that had no flaws and were perfect in every way. He wanted to examine characters who he felt had flaws and who weren't perfect in every way, but they tried and they made a difference in their worlds, and they just wanted to do the right thing in the end. And that him making those kinds of stories for dealing with minorities, that was a good testament to that. And interesting enough, back when Stan Lee was back in the early 60s when Stan Lee started, it's like teenagers were seen as delinquents, and there weren't much media that portrayed teenagers as the heroes, because basically speaking, Americans just saw teenagers as troublemakers and ruffians that were going to destroy society. But Stan Lee came around and created Spider-Man, who was a teenage superhero, and he had to fight his editors on a constant daily basis, and he fought with his editors a lot to make these kinds of stories, because at the time the idea of making a teenage superhero was ludicrous, because they were generally reserved for sidekicks and they had older mentors to mentor them. Stan Lee was all about breaking those kinds of creative rules that you couldn't break. And in a way, I'm sure comic fans know about the infamous comics code that toned down comics for the longest time. He actually played a part in getting that removed. So he's a destroyer of censorship as well. It's like, the more I read about this guy, the more amazing he gets. It's fantastic. Or should I say Fantastic Four? That was bad, I apologize. But, so yeah. So in the long run, it's like, I was never that big into comic books, but Stan Lee seemed to always be like what everybody thought of when they thought of comic books, because he was probably the most mainstream comics creator ever, because he was all over the place. Movies, TV shows. I remember when he made an appearance in The Simpsons, of all things. And he was great in that. He just seemed like the kind of guy who you could hang out with, and it was fun to be around. And I'm so glad and so happy that I'm getting the chance to make this kind of video, because I learned a lot about him, and I hope I'm teaching you guys a lot about him as well, because he truly was a fascinating and legendary individual. Catching my breath for a second. And he was one of those guys who believed that art imitates life. He saw the things going on in the world, and he wanted to make a difference with his stories, and I think in a way he probably did. So, rest in peace, Stan Lee. Your legacy will always be felt, especially by people like me, because you weren't only a legend of the comic book industry, but a legend of artwork and storytelling as well. So in the mighty words of you and your home state of New York, Excelsior. We some southern boys with the
arm of strength. Ain't nobody man enough to feel the pain. And you could be next. You better give respect, cause ain't